10 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and get us started. Good morning. I am Taylor Post, Swiftland's Office Manager, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Cataloging Audio Resources, and today's presenter, Bobby Bothman. Bobby Bothman is a Metadata and Emerging Technologies Librarian in Library Services at Minnesota State University. Bobby catalogs monographic resources and investigates new technologies. He holds an MLIS from the University of Wisconsin and an MS in Geography and English Technical Communication from Minnesota State University. Bobby teaches cataloging for the iSchool at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Sorry about that. Please help me welcome Bobby and enjoy his webinar this morning.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. I think I'm frozen. Hold on a second. There we go. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. Just a quick word of warning. I've got a little frog in my throat, so if there's a pause, it just may be me muting my microphone for a moment to cough and get that out of the way. And I also wanted to just remind everyone that in the lower right corner of the slides, you'll see a big number for the slide number. So when you have questions, please feel free to ask them at any point. And if you could also reference that slide number for your question, that can be really helpful for the context and getting back to that. And anytime you have questions, please ask. So today, 2 weeks ago, we talked about electronic resources, and today we're going to talk about audio resources, so specifically spoken word. Music audio recordings are a bit of a different beast, and so that would be a different session. We're going to use Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince as our example as we walk through and look at things today. There will be some other examples that come up to show some differences, but the primary one will be Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. And over on the right, we see a symbol chart. So at times, there will be Program for Cooperative Cataloging, or PCC guidance, and I will note that with that symbol. There will be times when you, as an institution, will want to make decisions, local decisions, and document those decisions. And so we've got that dog-eared page icon there for that. And then finally, there will be times that there will be Library of Congress Program for Cooperative Cataloging policy statements. With the green icon, the LCPCC-PS is the acronym, and I just call them policy statements because it's much faster and easier to say. So when there's a reference for those, we have that particular icon. All right, so let's, oh, that might not be showing up. Let's see. There it is. Okay, the disk label is going to be your friend. So most of the time, we're going to be, so this first part is going to focus on CD audio and cataloging of disks. And then later on in this session, we will look at the playaway and what we do with those, and also what we do with the streaming and downloadable. And so for now, it's the disk label. And if perchance you are doing any audio cassettes, which I think most libraries aren't doing anymore, but if you've got any and you need to do them, then the cassette itself, the cassette label, is a fine substitute for disk label if you need to do that. So the disk label is generally going to be your friend. That's the place that you want to look at for all of the information to start with. So prefer it whenever possible. And we've got two examples here. On the right, we have Inferno by Dan Brown, and on the left, we have Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince by J.K. Rowling. So you can see on the right, Inferno has a title, and that is a good thing. We have a source of information from this disk label. But sometimes that doesn't happen. As we can see on the left with Harry Potter, there are no words for the title of that particular work. So in that case, we're going to have to use something else for our preferred source of information. But again, whenever possible, use the disk label. And the thing that I want to stress with the disk label is that this is something that is less mutable than the container, which is why we prefer the disk label. It will have the title, it will have the statement of responsibility usually, there will be copyright dates on there, there will be publisher and distribution information on there, so that's why we want to prefer the disk label. The other thing is that oftentimes, because of the space limitations, the disk label will just have the title proper and will not carry other title information. And this will be important a little bit later when we talk about other title information. So if you've got what we see on the left with Harry Potter, then plan A, our disk is blank, so plan B, let's watch the animation for a moment. There we go. Plan B is going to be to use the container. So on the container, we've got a title, we have a statement of responsibility, we see information that we can use. The container will often have this on multiple sides, so you'll just need to pick one side and use that as your preferred source of information. When we look on the back of the container, we'll see more information such as the ISBN, a catalog number, for example. We'll see how the duration, how many units there are, and then sometimes there's more information on the sleeves that hold the discs. So this is the sleeve for discs 8, 9, and 10, and we can see more copyright information. We can see who the publisher is as well, and we see the producer and director. So these are information pieces that you will want to look for and identify their locations at the outset of your cataloging. So for the title proper, we're going to transcribe what we see. With Inferno, we can do that directly from the disk label. We see that here on the lower left image, and so we just transcribe what we see. On the right one, we're going to take it from the container, so Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. Your capitalization, so we've got this dog ear here, is an institutional and or cataloger's choice. Most libraries are following, with RDA, are following Appendix A of RDA, which specifies a capitalization that is the same as what we saw with AACR2, which is that we capitalize the first word of the title proper, and we capitalize proper nouns. And so what we see here with these two examples, it fits both of them actually, because Half-Blood Prince in the novel is a title, and thus it actually gets capitalized. You would have to read it to know that, but that is a true thing there. So note on the title proper, for all audio resources of any kind in nature, because they don't have a title page and they don't have a title frame, then we must supply a source of the title proper. So most of the time you're going to use title from disk label. In the case of Harry Potter, that is of course not possible, and so we took the title from the container, and that's why we have title from container. RDA is meant to give us data that is parsed in a manner that the computer can understand. So while you can certainly use the 500 field for these notes, The 588 field is specifically designed to say that this is that this data are from these data are specifying the source of information. So that's what 588 means, and we want to go to this parsed type of data as much as possible so that when we transition this data into BibFrame, the computer will be able to identify this information as source of title information. So that's why the 588 is important. The statement of responsibility. So when we're dealing with audio resources, spoken word, particularly for literature, the statement of responsibility is for the person or persons who created the content. It is not going to be for the performer or narrator or presenter unless they are actually the authors of the text that is being spoken. So your statement of responsibility is only going to be for those people who created the content. Here we see J.K. Rowling in the image. We see J.K. Rowling, and underneath that, performance by Jim Dale. So J.K. Rowling is the creator of the content. She goes in the statement of responsibility. Performance by Jim Dale, that is not a statement of creation. That is a statement of contribution. And so we will deal with that in a separate space. So J.K. Rowling for Harry Potter, Dan Brown for Inferno. And we record what we see, of course. So if we had something in front of this, like a novel by J.K. Rowling, written by J.K. Rowling, or just by J.K. Rowling, all of those words will be transcribed. So note on the statement of responsibility, we used to have specific instructions in RDA for the performer, narrator, and presenter, and also for artistic and or technical credit. Those were removed several years ago at this point, and now we have to look at 2.17.3 RDA, which is the note on statement of responsibility. It does not identify any of these elements here, like performer or artistic and technical credit. We just have to know that this note or this note on statement of responsibility instruction is including them. So that is something that if you're coming from an AACR2 tradition, you would expect to find instructions specific for these, and they're gone. And it's all included in 2.17.3 at this point. So what we do with those is when we see information about a performer or a narrator, somebody who reads something, record what you see and put it in a 511 field. And the first indicator will be a 0. So we see on the container, performance by Jim Dale, so we just record what we see. It's much easier to record what we see than to reformat the words in some sort of different way. And then the read by, narrated by, and performed by, or performance by, however they state it, those are going to be important later when we talk about the designators that go on the access point for the person's name. So we'll talk about that in a bit. Artistic and or technical credit. So sometimes those are noted on the audio recordings. We see that here, produced by David Rapkin and Orly Moskovitz, and then below that, directed by David Rapkin, and then below that, production associate Louis Milgram. So the important information that we want is the producer and the director. If you see somebody whose function is assistant or associate or co, those you can ignore. They're not considered significant. Really what we want are the producer and the director, and just record them the way that you see them. So you don't need to change anything or reorder anything, and you can use a semicolon to separate the different statements. Designations of addition. So this one is a little different from what we did with AACR2 as well. If you see unabridged, then, or the word abridged, either one, those are considered designations of addition, and you just put them in the 250 field. The 250 field is repeatable now, so if you see multiple addition statements, you don't have to contrive a method of putting them into one field. You can list them separately in separate 250 fields. And then you only need to supply this designation of addition or version if the addition statement consists only of letters or numbers or is otherwise not clear at all. So you would put those, of course, in square brackets. And then if there is some sort of addition statement that you know applies but isn't on the resource itself, you would, of course, put that whole thing in square brackets because you're taking it from outside the resource itself. But you don't need to add anything to abridged or unabridged as an addition statement. Publication statement. So this is a core element for RDA, and we use the 264 field with a second indicator of 1 to designate a publication statement. It's got our typical 3 elements of the place of publication, the publisher name, and the date. So we'll deal first with the publisher name. Generally, we want to take the publisher name from the same source as the title proper. So if the title proper is taken from the disc label, then you want to look on the disc label to find the publisher name. And for Harry Potter, since we took the title proper from the container, we're looking on the containers for a publication statement. And we see that in the lower right image with the circle around it, listening library. And we can see it is an imprint of Random House Audio Publishing Group. So here's the deal with imprints and audio. They're all over the map. You'll find 3 or 4 different names on these sources of information, the disk labels and the containers. And so you need to take the one that is the most prominent and is the most clearly identified as the publisher. Usually that's going to be Listening Library for those that are published by Listening Library. You may see some other big ones, but go with what you see that's prominent. And then once you've identified the publisher name, then you want to look and see, is there a place of publication associated with that publisher name? In this case, we've got the mailing address, and so we would use New York, NY as our place of publication. There are a lot of audio publishers who don't supply their place, and so you can use United States in square brackets as the place of publication. There are some where we know the place just from having seen it so often. There's Tantor and the one in Frederick, Maryland, whose name escapes me at this point, are ones that we see often who don't supply a place, but if you have cataloged these over time, you probably will know where they go. So you can certainly supply those place names from memory and looking and seeing earlier or other versions of what they publish. And then, of course, the date of publication. So we see this date of publication in square brackets, and that's because we're not seeing any publication date presented on either the disk label or the container, and that's very common. It is exceedingly uncommon to actually find a date of publication on audio material and audio resources. So what we see here on both the disk and on the container is the C copyright date with the name of the creator, and then after that we see the P copyright date. So that P in a circle is called a phonogram, and it is the copyright date of the recorded sound. And that is the important date for audio recordings, because that's the copyright date for the content of what you are cataloging. And then this day and age, usually the audio is released at the same time as the print, and so you will see the C copyright and the P copyright dates often being exactly the same. And what you're seeing there, the C copyright date is the copyright date that applies to the text, to the work that is the text, and it does not apply to the sound content, the audio content that you are cataloging. So the date you are really interested in and should rely on most and first is the P copyright date. You will find this with older materials, that sometimes the C copyright date is earlier than the P copyright date, and that's okay. There can be times when the C copyright date is more recent than the P copyright date. What that means is that the audio has been republished in a new package, and so you would use that most recent copyright date to infer your publication date. So use the most recent copyright date, regardless of whether it is C or P, for inferring your publication date. And then when you have your copyright date, you do want to include the P date. If the C date is different and more recent, go ahead and add another 264 field, second indicator 4, and record that C copyright date. Okay. And if you need to, here's an example. If you need to, so you can have multiple 264 second indicator 4s, and if you need to, or you feel it's necessary to really specify why you're doing that, you can use subfield 3 to provide some more information about that. So here is a fictional thing that I created for the example purpose, but I decided that maybe we had an anniversary edition that was published in 2005, and that's why we might have a 2005 publication date for audio that was created in 1995. Identifier for the manifestation. So with audio resources, there's usually an ISBN for the audio books. Go ahead and record that in the 020 field, remembering to omit the letters ISBN and to omit the hyphens. Keep in mind that the capital letter X in the ISBN is part of the ISBN number. It's actually the Roman numeral 10, so it's meant to be there. Oftentimes for audio, we will find either on the container or on the disk, usually on the disk, some sort of catalog number. And so we see that here on the disk, just below the copyright information. It says YA760A. We see that also underneath the barcode on the container. So sometimes we see it in multiple places, and that's a really good indicator that it is a catalog number. We use the 028 field for that, put the catalog number in the subfield A, and then put the trade name of the source, which is usually the publisher name in subfield B. And of course, if you want to include the UPC code in a 024 field, you can do that. For the media type, we're going to use audio, and that will go in field 337. And then the carrier type for compact discs, of course, we're going to use audio disc, and that comes from the 338 field. And then we'll use audio disc in the extent when we get to the extent portion. The carrier type instruction in RDA has this list of approved terms for various audio carriers. So if you've got an audio cassette, you would use that term as all one word, audio cassette. CDs will, of course, be audio disc. And then we have, I talked about this the last time as well, but in Connection Client, there's that lovely macro that will add these 33x fields for you. It will read what you have coded in the fixed fields and control fields, and then understand what to offer as a term for the media, the content, and the carrier. And so you can get more information at Joel Hahn's OCLC macro library. It comes automatically with the Connection Client when you install it. So it's an easy thing to set up. And if you need any help with that, Lyrasis or I'm sure Swiflin can help you with that as well. So for the extent, again, we're taking that term from the carrier term that we just identified, audio discs. We see that there are 17 of them. It says 17 compact discs, but we're going to use audio discs because that's the term that RDA is instructing us to use. So, of course, if there's only one disc, it would be one audio disc, singular. 17, we're going to make discs plural. So make sure to monitor the number agreement with the words. So RDA does allow exceptions. So if it is more important for your users that you use compact discs or sound discs, then by all means do that. Just make sure that you document that alternative that you're using locally. When you put it in WorldCat, of course, please use audio discs and then make alterations locally for your own use. For dimensions, if you have an audio cassette, we're measuring the length and the height of the face of the cassette in centimeters. And that's where you will get 10 by 7 centimeters. And then you follow that with a comma and provide the width of the tape in millimeters. So the general audio cassette is 10 by 7 centimeters, comma, 4 millimeter tape. In AACR2, we never provided dimensions for standard audio cassettes. That was something that was part of the rules. With RDA, that's not the case. We will always provide the dimensions for an audio cassette. And we do that in metric using centimeters and millimeters. Discs, however, which are 12 centimeters in diameter, and you can, of course, use those, but the policy statement is to record the diameter of discs in imperial units, so 4 3/4 inches. And we do that for audio and video and computer discs because they're all the same size, so they all get recorded in 4 3/4 inches in North America. If you want to deviate from that, do make documentation about it in your for your local practices. The best practice, according to OLAC, is to follow the policy statement, which is to use the imperial units. Sound characteristics. So we talked about this very briefly in the last session 2 weeks ago. Sound characteristics go from A to H in this list, the type of recording, the recording medium, etc. Much of it is applicable only to LPs, and some of it is applicable only to magnetic tapes. So there's not a whole lot of it that is going to be important for us in terms of CD audio or streaming or downloadable audio. So the ones that are most important to us we'll talk about in a moment, but what I want to draw your attention to is on these audio discs, just beneath the logo for compact disc, you will see, not all the time, but often, 3 letters in 3 boxes. And it will be either the letter A or the letter D. The letter A meaning analog, and the letter D meaning digital. So the first box is about the recording, the second box is about mixing, and the third box is about transfer. The only one that's important for us in terms of the next step of cataloging is the first box, because it tells us whether it's an analog or a digital recording. Basically anything that has been created since the year 2000 is assuredly going to be digital. If it was created before 2000, if it was in the 90s, it probably was digital in the later part. And the earlier part, it could have been analog or digital. So that's when we were transitioning with the recording between analog and digital. If it's earlier than that, the 80s, and for sure anything in the 1970s and earlier, those are going to be analog recordings. So based on that P copyright date, when you see when the sound recording was actually created, that can also help you if this information is not there to deduce that. But anything after the year 2000, if that information isn't there, just assume that it's probably digital. And so that means for the type of recording in subfield A, you will choose analog or digital. For the recording medium, if you've got an audio cassette, it will be magnetic. If you've got CD audio, it will be optical. For playing speed, for an LP, if you're doing any of those, then use the revolutions per minute style. Interestingly, for audio cassettes, the policy statement in RDA from Library of Congress is saying to use 1 7/8 inches per second for analog tapes. For CD audio, you don't really need to worry about it, but in case you're curious, the playing speed is 1.4 meters per second, which is in that last option. And if you want to use metric for your analog tapes, your audio cassettes, those are 4.75 centimeters per second. Playing speed is usually only recorded, though, for LPs. Configuration of playback channels. So if it is something that is current from the 1980s forward, it is almost assuredly going to be stereo. If it's something earlier than that, it could have been mono sound or stereo sound. Usually if it's mono, it will be explicit and say that it is mono. And particularly in the 70s and 80s, they would identify it as stereo. And then after that, it's just assumed that it will be stereo. If they say more specifically that it's quadraphonic or surround or something more exciting, then certainly go ahead and record that in the subfield G. But usually you can just rely on stereo for most things that are produced today, unless it says otherwise. And then subfield H for special playback characteristics. We probably would see this more for audio cassettes. I haven't run into it for CD audio at all, but if it does have something like Dolby or DBX encoded, then supply that in subfield H. So for our sound characteristics, here's an example. I went all out and added the the playing speed in there with 1.4 meters per second, so you can see what it might look like. You, of course, don't need to do that for CD audio, but you can if you so desire. It's not wrong. Digital file characteristics. So we've got a couple that will be important later on when we talk about the downloadable or streaming sound. For CD audio, the only one that's important is subfield B, the encoding format, and that's where we would use CD audio. You, of course, won't need digital file characteristics for audio cassettes, and then we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but if you've got streaming or downloadable, then you would have subfield A, audio file. The encoding format will probably be MP3. If there's a file size for something that's downloadable, you would give that in subfield C. And then for streaming, if they identify a transmission speed, you can record that in subfield F. So for our Harry Potter disc, the only one that's important is the encoding format. Subfield B, CD audio, and then we add the subfield 2 RDA to show that we're following the RDA standard. Subfield A is not used, so you don't need to worry about having a subfield A. It's just subfield B. For your OPAC considerations, so the subfield B of the 300 field is not used with audio resources. We don't put digital, we don't put sound or anything in there. We've already done that with this 344 and 347 field. Those fields are designed to be used in a linked data bibframe type of environment. They don't show to the public. So you may want to put some of that information if it's important to your users, like digital, like stereo, in the subfield B if that's important. You could also use the 538 field if you need to. The 500 field compact discs is not necessary with RDA because we've identified it as CD audio in that 347 field. But if it's helpful for your users, do feel free to add it. And then it would be preferable actually to use the 655 field for controlled vocabulary access. So you can use 655 compact discs when in your records for those. There's no changes really with acquisition access information. It's all the same as it's been before. Again, keep it local, not in OCLC. So if you make changes to records for your local practices that deviate from national standards, do make sure you document what those are, do it according to national standards in WorldCat, and then make those changes when you bring it into your own system. So the content type, we're not talking about musical recordings here, but from time to time you may have a spoken word audio resource that might have significant performed music. So if that's the case, then go ahead and add a second content type that identifies performed music. Usually it's just going to be spoken word. Again, this will be supplied by that macro that I was talking about earlier. It's just later on in this presentation because content type goes with the expression entity, not the manifestation entity. So we've completed the information about the manifestation. Now we're talking about the expression. Intended audience. So the intended audience note goes in the 521 field, and if you are cataloging resources that are intended for children, juvenile sound recordings, then it is a core element, according to the Library of Congress, to supply intended audience. So that is a good thing to follow. Be sure to make that documentation. If you're doing juvenile, add an intended audience. Usually, there's not always good intended audience information with sound recordings for things, so you can certainly go like to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or some website and look that up. Amazon is really good about providing reading levels in the product details portion. So I often just go there and look that up and just record what I see. Intended audience, you can take that information from any source. It doesn't have to come from the resource itself, and you don't have to identify where it came from either. Summarization of content. So this goes in the 520 field. It's always a nice idea to supply a summary. With juvenile resources, we do have to supply a summary that is also part of the cataloging standard for juvenile resources. It's nice to have it for anything that is fiction, also nonfiction if you can. Usually the container will supply something for you, or you could go to the publisher's website and copy and paste from there, or from Amazon, and just remove the superlatives from the information that you find, and make it as pithy and short as you possibly can. So you don't want to give spoilers away, of course, but you also want to supply enough information that the person has an idea of what the content of the story is about. And then the nice part of that, too, is that the summary will supply you with keywords that can also be helpful in doing the subject analysis for the resource that you're cataloging, particularly if it is for fiction. Place and date of capture. So this is not something that you need to supply for commercially produced audio, but you may have audio that was made locally for some reason, like a city government meeting, for example, or maybe somebody came and gave a talk at the library or at the college or something like that, and you've recorded it. So what you want is a place and date of capture. And there's two ways to do this. They both use the 518 field. The first one is to just give a generalized statement in a subfield A and say where it was recorded and when. The second way is one where we can parse the data specifically and put the date in subfield D and then put the place in subfield P. So we've got the nice mnemonic there of P for place and D for date. There is a date standard to follow, but you get to choose it. So it's not something that is standardized across everything. It's more of a institutional choice. I should have added a little dog-ear logo there for this one. So there's multiples that you can choose from, and if you go to the 518 field in the MARC format on the Library of Congress website, it will provide a little more information there for you. So you can use, and again, also for the place, they're asking you to use a standardized format. They don't define what standard to use, so you can use a one that you create on your own. You could follow the name authority file, so it's a decision that you have to make. And again, these are really helpful for things that have been locally produced, for example, or you might have commercially produced audio recordings, such as famous speeches by presidents, for example. And so then they would have in their place and date information, and you can supply those as well. I think 518 is repeatable, so you can have as many of them as you need to have. Duration. So the duration, the playing time or running time of the audio content is, for the Library of Congress, a core element. Helpful thing to have. Often we have heard that there are no more abbreviations in RDA, and that's not exactly true. RDA asks us to abbreviate the units of time. So hour, whether it's singular or plural, hour, minute, and second are abbreviated as HR period, MIN period, and SEC period. So make use of those abbreviations for units of time in your durations. And then record what you see. So this is the nice part. We don't have to reformat anything. We can take what we see and record it the way that we see it. So here on the container for Harry Potter, we see approximately 19 hours. Approximately is a word that we do not need to abbreviate anymore, but I did because I'm just transcribing what I see in this particular case for the example in A. If it's presented like a clock, 1:30:00, just record it that way. If it's presented as 12 hours and 14 minutes, record it that way. So you don't need to fuss with it. Just take what you see and put it in the parentheses. And this will immediately follow the extent term, which was 17 compact discs. So that's represented by the ellipses. If it's not explicitly stated, but you can approximate it, then go ahead and use approximately. And sometimes that is something that you can do easily with audio cassettes, because you know that they're either 30 or 90 minutes on a side, right? So that's something that you can usually approximate. If it's not ascertainable and you can't approximate it, don't worry about it. It just won't be there. For awards, again, awards are something that you should decide as an institution which ones are important for your users, because there are tons of awards and you could spend your life adding a list of awards to many of these audio recordings. So if there are ones that are important, feel free to record them. They go in a 586 field. You can have as many 586 fields as you need to have. Wikipedia is a good source to see what awards an audio recording has been given. There may be specific ones that are local. There may be, like, the State Library Association may provide awards, and that might be something that's important for your users. So just think about those and go ahead and record them. If it's right there on the container and you feel that that would be a nice thing to include, you can, of course, record that from the container as well. So name elements. I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the performers, and when it said read by or narrated by or performed by. So I wanted to call your memory back to that. With our name elements, when we provide the access points from the name authority file, then we can also add these relationship designators in subfield E. The relationship designators are defined in Appendix I. We have to use the terms that are provided in Appendix I that equate to whatever the role might be. So, for example, if the author of the book is also the narrator on the audio recording, then you would have two different roles, and then you would also need two different relationship designators. So the first one being author, the second one being narrator. You use a comma-separated list, and each term goes in its own subfield E. So if J.K. Rowling had actually narrated her own book, she would get narrator, and it is okay for narrator or illustrator or something like that to go on an access point that is a 100 field. That's perfectly okay. For your other roles like producer, director, those types of things, go ahead and add them. You'll see they'll be designated anyway in your 511 or 508 fields. So that's a pretty easy thing to look at and record. Here we've got Dale, Jim, so the access point for Jim Dale. And we have him as storyteller. I think I have a separate slide. Let me just make sure. Yes. So narrator versus storyteller. So Appendix I RDA has two relationship designators for different agents on audio recordings. And one is narrator and the other is storyteller. So a narrator is specifically for those agents who read or narrate. So if it says read by or narrated by, use narrator as your subfield E relationship designator term. But if it says perform, performed by, performance by, then that's when we use storyteller. So there is a difference between the two in the way that the audio is delivered, and that's why we've got this distinction between narrator and storyteller. So this is just more of the same, where we have the subfield E terms. Again, they're only used on access points for agents associated with the resource. We are not going to use them in relationships that are name title access points that refer to another work or another expression of a work. And then we've got this link right here. The easy way to do this is to just go to Appendix I or Appendix J in RDA, and you'll see the green LCPCCPS icon. You click on that, and it has this link right there for you, or you can copy and paste that into your browser. And it has a really nice tutorial that goes through how and when to use these different relationship designators that go on the end of access points for names or that precede the relationship to another work or expression. And then that particular guide also says that if there is a relationship designator that would be more appropriately expressed using one of the RDA element terms like creator or publisher or manufacturer, that we can use one of those RDA element names as the relationship designator. So, recording relationships. I mentioned earlier, for example, the 588 field, where we want to parse out specifically that the source of the title is coming from a specific place, and the 588 identifies that information. That's what we call structured data or structured descriptions. And so the general English language note that might go in a 500 field, that's an unstructured description. You as a human can read it and understand it and know what it applies to, but when the computer looks at that, it just sees text, 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 and it doesn't understand what to do with it. Whereas with a 588 field, for example, it would know this is connected to the title proper in the 245 subfield A, and so I know I can connect these things and say that this title is coming from this source. And this is the type of structured information that RDA is trying to help us create, so that in a linked data environment, the computer can put all of these things together for us. So when we talk about structured data, one of the things that we sometimes need to do is create a relationship to a related work or expression. And when we do that, we're going to use a 700, 710, 711, or 730 field to identify a work or expression. They are asking us not to use the 740 field for this purpose. So here on the print record for Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, we can point to the related expression, which is the sound recording, the audio recording. And so we identify that expression using the authorized access point for the creator, which is rolling, JK, the preferred title for the work, which is Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, and then in subfield S, we have spoken word, and that identifies the expression. So that's identifying the content type, which helps us identify the expression. So that's the best way that we can create a relationship right now using the relationship designators between the text and the spoken word expressions of a particular work. We can also use it to identify the sequel and the sequel to that particular work that we're cataloging. So Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince is the sequel to Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, and it has the sequel Harry Potter and Deathly Hallows, and the Deathly Hallows. I think I missed a word in that title, my apologies. So we can identify the sequel and the sequel to. This is really helpful for books that are not part of an actual series. Like Harry Potter, there's 7 of them. It's we think of it as a series, but there's no series title to it, right? And particularly in public libraries, users are really interested in finding that series. And so if books do not have a designated series title, but they're part of a continuum, then you can certainly start indicating that with the sequel to and sequel information to provide that. Manifestations, if you have an equivalent manifestation, such as the ebook and the print book, or the audio and the electronic audio, then we use the 776 field for that. It still has the creator access point, the preferred title, but it will also include information like the edition and the publication information. We can also include in the subfield Z the ISBN if that's appropriate, and also subfield W can refer us to the OCLC number for that particular record. More related works, so formal contents notes are a type of structured description. We put those in a 505 field. Again, we omit chapter and section numbering, and we use a space, dash space to separate the components. If each of these chapters is a work in and of its own right, then we would use an enhanced 505, where we put the title in a subfield T, and then we put the agent responsible in a subfield R. When it comes to fiction, we usually do not use a 505 because the contents for fiction is only appropriate within that fictional world and doesn't lend any information to the user. For nonfiction, we do like to have table of contents, but they're usually not given to us for audio recordings. So you can certainly, if you feel it's important, you can pull that 505 from the bibliographic record for the text and paste it in for the audio if you want to do that. If you feel it's important, feel free to add that. So here's an example of, this is for David Sedaris, one of his books. So each one is a story, right, or an essay. When that happens, you may have a table of contents, and so go ahead and record those. In this case, each chapter is a work in its own right, which is why we've got them in a subfield T. And then sometimes you may even have duration for each chapter that is given. And if that is important to add, go ahead and do that. You can just follow the title with a subfield G and put the duration in parentheses. If it's not an enhanced table of contents, then you would not use subfield G. It would just be the duration in parentheses following the chapter title. So, conventional collective titles. This is nothing that you need to do, but I want you to see it so that when you see it in cataloging that you get, you understand what's happening. So this is an LC practice only. PCC libraries are not doing this. Most other libraries are not doing this either. But if you read closely 6.2.2.10.3, it says when you have a collective work that, and there's a collective title for it, that we should also still add a conventional collective title. So that's the thing like short stories or works, if you've got the complete works of somebody, which can't happen until they die, which is why we always have selections for people who are living. And so every time David Sedaris publishes a new book of short stories, the LC will add this 240 with a conventional collective title, short stories, subfield K, selections. And so that's what you're seeing there. And then the other thing that they will do is that they will add the short stories in the 505 field using a subfield T, so the enhanced version. And then they will add one 700 field with the relationship designator container of work, and then have the authorized access point for that particular short story, the first one that's named, and then that's where they stop. So they just do the first short story and no others. It's one of those things that they are talking about maybe revising. So this could change over time, but if you see this, it's not, it looks a little wacky, but I assure you that it's on the up and up. It's an LC practice, and you don't need to edit it or anything like that. It's perfectly okay. So here is an example for the audio discs, a full record of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. And I know it's tiny, so I hope that it works. I omitted the subject analysis for space reasons, but we can see here the title proper, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, and then the statement of responsibility, which is referring only to the creator of the content itself. We've got unabridged. We have our P copyright date for the copyright date of recorded sound. We've got 17 audio discs with the duration in parentheses following it. I used a metric here, but most libraries are going to use 4 3/4 inches for the dimensions there. We've got our content, media, and carrier terms, spoken word, audio, and audio disc. Of course, these are things, again, that the 336, 337, 338, these can be supplied by the macro. We have our sound characteristics laid out in field 344, and our digital file characteristics in 347. So the OPAC display doesn't show these elements, right? They are designed to, this is another example of structured data. They are designed to be used in a linked data environment so that you can select and narrow your result set. If it's important for you to show that it's CD audio, that it's stereo to your users, again, make some local decisions about whether you're going to use a 538 field or a 500 field, or if you're going to put them in a 300 subfield B in your local catalog. We've got our performer here. We've got our technical credits here in the 508, and then we've got our added access points for the storyteller and the technical people, the producer and director. We've got our sequel to and sequel references. So these are relationship designators to two different works, and we know the designation that one is the sequel to and the other is the sequel. We've got our complemented by expression for the text, and then we've got one here for the online version. So I added all the things in the kitchen sink for this so that you could see all the different additions that could be made here. A record in OCLC and WorldCat does not need to have all of this stuff on it. Certainly make your choices locally as to what's important to add or include. Okay. Any questions so far on any of this before we talk about electronic audio resources? Okay, I will move along then with this. So what I'm going to do here is look at specific elements that will be different for electronic audio. And we're going to look at it from things that could be playaway devices, downloadable audiobooks, or streaming audiobooks. So all of these things fall into the other resources category, as do any tangible types of audio resources. So they're all other. And we have to find a place for our source of information for the title. It used to be, RDA has been flipping back and forth over time. It used to be for the digital resources that they wanted to prefer embedded metadata. They've switched to using visible words. So for your streaming and downloadable media, it will be the words that you see on the web page in front of you that you would use as your source of information. For a playaway, of course, you would want to prefer a fixed label to that. Information coming from outside the resource itself is something like, well, for a playaway, it might be accompanying material, but the publisher's website and that type of thing, that's usually what we're looking at for other sources. RDA does tell us that the container itself is part of the resource itself, so we can use that as necessary, and we don't have to worry too much about it being considered an other source. So here is the example for Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince as a digital audiobook, a digital download. This is coming from the website pottermore.com, which is the only place, still the only place you can get the electronic audio. And if you go there and you look up this book, it will look very different from what you see here, which really helps to illustrate why we do some of the things that we do with electronic resource cataloging, because stuff changes on these websites over time. So RDA is asking us to prefer what we see on the screen. And what we see on the screen is Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, parentheses, book 6, hyphen, digital audio book. So we want to use textual information and not the image. So we've got an image of the container over there. And while it probably would, in my head, make more sense to make use of that image instead, what we're really asked to do is to use the textual information. So what we see over here on the screen, and we can see also that it says by J.K. Rowling. So that word by is something that we will need to transcribe when we start transcribing our statement of responsibility. The nice part about these websites is they often give you a lot of information that you can use for like your digital file characteristics and your sound characteristics. So we know it's MP3, we know the duration, we know the file size. Down here, the bit rate, we've got the streaming transmission speed as well. So there's a lot of information here. Some of it's a little different. The publisher here is Random House / the Listening Library. And because RDA is founded on the principle of representation, which is that take what you see type of principle, the publisher here is going to look different than what we had for the CD audio, even though in reality it's the exact same entity. But the way that it's presented is different, so what we record will be different. So our media type, we're still going to include audio, but we will now also have to include computer as a second media type term in our record. And we're going to use that for the streaming and downloadable audio for the media type. For playaways, they are, even though they're technically digital content, we don't need a computer to make use of them. So playaways will not have the computer media type. So your carrier type for playaways, the only option is other. So you'll just have other as your carrier type. For the electronic resources, we're going to use online resource for the carrier type. And then for extent, our downloadable and streaming, we will use one online resource. You may, in parentheses, if you so desire, add something more specific, like one audio file or two audio files or one streaming audio. So that's up to you. There are some audiobooks, electronic audiobooks, that come in more than one file. So that could be important information to include if it is more than one. For playaways, I had a long conversation with Jay Whites at OCLC, and and also with some other people who are media catalogers, and we agreed that the best option for the extent term for playaways is to just call it what it is, one playaway. So when you're cataloging playaways, you don't need to say, I think with AACR2 we had something like self-contained media device or some contrived several words together. With RDA, just call it what it is. It's one playaway. For the sound characteristics, because we're dealing with electronic resources, everything's going to be digital. So the type of recording is digital, the recording medium is digital, playing speed is not going to be applicable for digital resources. The configuration of playback channels, that will usually be presented to you somewhere. It's usually going to be stereo. It could be mono for older sound recordings. Again, the special playback characteristics usually don't happen for audio, but if there is something, you can certainly record it in subfield H. And then for playaways specifically, the recording medium is non-volatile flash memory. So that's something that we know from having talked to the playaway creators. So OLAC did a best practices document in conjunction with the playaway producers to get all of that information right. Digital file characteristics. So this will be in the 347 field, and you will need to use all of these that are applicable. Take what's readily ascertainable. So if it's jumping up and down in front of your face, that's readily ascertainable. You don't need to do any digging to find this information. So if it's not presenting itself to you, then it's just not there, so don't worry about it. File type is an easy one. It's going to be audio file. If it's specifically only streaming, like you can't download it, then that's a streaming audio file, so you can use that term instead. Oftentimes it will be MP3, and if you see that, then give that as the encoding format. For playaways, they have a proprietary format that is ACELP. So for playaways, if you're doing those, you would just use that ACELP. File size, if it's presented, give that size. Use KB in all caps, MB in all caps, or GB in all caps as appropriate. And then encoded bit rate. If it's readily ascertainable, which we saw that it was on that earlier screen, we can record that. But again, if it's not there, which most of the time it isn't, then don't worry about it. Duration can end up being a little different, and sometimes for these audio, we'll see duration presented on the information on the website, but then in the player, you can see it on the little clock, and it'll be super specific. So you just have to choose which one you want to use. Usually, we're just going to take the one that we see that's presented in the text. Here it's 18.5 hours, so I just recorded it the same way, but I followed the abbreviation standard that RDA wants us to use. So you can see it's HR period in the 300 field as opposed to HRS that we see on the website. Again, if it's presented there, record it the way that you see it. The only way you can get it is to press play and then see what the timeline says on the bottom of the screen. Then by all means use that for the duration. That's perfectly fine. And you can present it in this clock fashion as well. However it presents itself to you is the way to do it. And so those are the main differences, not a whole lot. Here's an example playaway. This is completely fictional because Harry Potter actually doesn't exist on a playaway. But if it did, this is what it might look like. We've got the 264 field. Find Away World is the publisher of the playaway, so that's what the 264 field would look like. In our 300 field for the extent, we have one playaway, and for our carrier, we have the term other. And then you can see the sound and digital file characteristics laid out here in the 344 and 347 field. And then for the downloadable book, we have our title proper, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. And then other title information is where we've got book 6 in parentheses, followed by a digital audio book. The thing I didn't talk about, which I should have, we talked about it in the last episode, is the date of viewing. So, and this is why that's important. For the title from distributor's website is the source of the title proper. And the date viewed here was February 18th, 2013. And so now in 2020, if you go to pottermore.com and you look at Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, this book 6 digital audio book, that's gone. That doesn't exist anymore. And so that's why that viewed date that is associated with the source of the title is very important, because it lets us as catalogers know that, oh, it looked like that in 2013, even though it doesn't look like that today. So things will change over time, and that's why that date viewed is so important. So keep that in mind. You don't need to update it. If it looks different, you certainly can, but you don't need to do that. I think that's the last slide. It is. So we are at the end of the presentation, and if there are questions, I am happy to answer those now. Where in RDA can we find the order of the 5XX fields? That's a great question, Marta. RDA does not dictate presentation. So there is no order. AACR2 told us to enter things in rule order and then put the most important rule, I'm sorry, the most important instruction or note as the first one. RDA does not tell us to do anything like that. And part of the reason for that is that the assumption is that all of these different data elements will just be assembled and presented on the screen. Right now, we're still dealing with it in a MARC environment, and so there has to be an order because it's a flat file structure, right? So you get to choose what the order is. You can put the most important one first. I think the PCC recommends to just put them in numeric order, so 500, 501, 502, etc. I tend to, having grown up with our AACR2, I kind of do that particular order. Another way you could do it is to do it in the RDA instruction order. So it really doesn't matter. And the other reason I'll say it doesn't matter is that the order that you put it in is not necessarily the order that your OPAC will display it in, because a lot of these newer web-scale discovery services only show certain information, and they only do it in a specific order, and it's not a fluid type of order that can be changed, which is kind of frustrating, but that's the world we live in now. You're welcome. I saw a little typing. Any other questions? Malka is asking, what should be done if the title on the website has changed and the record you find has the title found in 2013? So again, it depends upon whether we're talking about a monographic item or an integrating resource type of item. For an integrating resource, and this is what we'll talk about in our in-person session, you would update the 245 with the current title and move the old one down to a 247. In this case, because it's a static type of thing, we don't have to worry about it in reality because the title proper has not changed. It has stayed the same. Other title information that we see in the subfield B, that if that changes, that is not a big thing. And what you can certainly do is you can add a 246, for example, that has, you could add subfield I title as of whatever date, if that's a really important thing to do. But for monographic cataloging, for electronic resource types of things, the title information, the way it was presented at the time it was recorded, is usually what we will stick with. So Marilyn's asking for the content note. Do we include cello player and piano player? So if you're doing performed music, the performers would be in a 511 field. So the piano player, the cello player, or the instrumentalists who are named, the orchestra, the chamber orchestra, whatever it might be, those are all performers, and those will go in a 511 field as a performer. The contents note would just be the title of the pieces that are being performed. You could include the composer of those in the 505, but usually we would do those actually in a and a relationship in the 700 fields for music. You're welcome. All right. Time for one more question, maybe. If not, thanks for coming, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in about 2 weeks, I think, right?
I believe so.
And yep.
If there
And
are no
thank you to
questions,
Deb, who has followed along so so great with me.
thank you, Bobby, for such an informative webinar this morning. Attendees, if you enjoyed this webinar, we ask that you join us at the Swiftland office on Thursday, February 6th, for Bobby's workshop, Cataloging Continuous Resources and Moving Image Resources. As always, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland CE calendar, the Swiftland Facebook page, or your message from the listserv. Thank you for attending and have a great rest of your